Welcome security professionals to yet another video where we explore another critical security concept. This one is called risk assessment, and most importantly, I will walk you through a tool called a risk assessment matrix in this video, which will empower you to make risk assessment your competitive advantage. So let's jump right into the video. So risk assessment matrix for private security agencies, a very powerful and a very important concept. But before we get into the matrix, let's just understand the difference between risk and threat. These two terms are often used interchangeably, but these two are not the same. So what is a threat? A threat is anything that has the potential to cause harm, whereas the risk reflects the potential impact if a threat materializes. So risk takes into account two things: the probability of the threat materializing and the impact that the threat will cause if it materializes. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you are standing in an open ground. So a threat that you will get hit by lightning is there. So that is the threat, that you might get hit by lightning. But let's say for whatever reason, the probability is zero that you will get hit by lightning. So even though there is a threat, the risk is non-existent because the probability of that threat materializing is zero. So here is a simple formula to calculate risk. It is nothing but threat probability into the impact. Basically, the likelihood of the threat materializing into the impact that it will cause if it materializes. So now we'll jump into the risk assessment matrix. So this is how your risk assessment matrix looks like. On the y-axis, you have the probability or the likelihood of a threat materializing. And on the x-axis, you have the impact that the threat will have once it gets materialized. So the bubbles that you see here, they represent the risks. So here in this example, we can see there are 4 risks that are currently depicted on this risk assessment matrix. What do the color shadings mean? Green means that the level of risk is low, and red means that the level of risk is high. So a lot of people use different terminologies. What we have used in this example is that whatever is green will be called a sustainable risk, and whatever is deep red will be called a critical risk. So I'll show you how this risk assessment matrix is getting populated and why it is such an important concept. So here you see we are in the risk DB sheet. This is basically a database of all the risks that you as a private security agency will tabulate as part of your risk assessment exercise before you take on an assignment, right? So as an illustrative example, what I've done is I've used 4 sample risks, right? So there is unauthorized access, there is theft, there is vandalism or sabotage, and then there is insider threat. What you have in the next column is the description of that risk. That is something that you will add on as and when you do the risk assessment. Now, what is most important are these two columns, column F and G. In F, you have impact, which is in rupee terms, and in G, you have probability, which is in percentages, right? So here in this example, what we have calculated is that if unauthorized access were to happen, the impact is to the tune of 10 lakh rupees. Same, if theft were to happen, then the impact is 25 lakh rupees. Vandalism causes an impact of 30 lakh rupees, whereas an insider threat can cause an impact up to 50 lakh rupees. Now, what is the probability of unauthorized access? It is only 5% as per our assessment, right? So this probability, this calculation or the estimation of the likelihood of a threat materializing is actually a very important and mission critical skill for a private security agency. Because if you get this wrong, your whole risk assessment exercise will go for a toss. So that is extremely important to estimate, right? Theft has a probability of 40%. Vandalism has a probability of 10% and insider threat has a probability of 40%. Based on these two metrics and the categorization system that you would employ in your PSA, there is a category which is given to all the risks. So you see, unauthorized risk is categorized as a sustainable risk, whereas insider threat is categorized as a critical risk. There are 2 more categories in our system of risk assessment. So from sustainable, you move to moderate, then you have severe, and the most dangerous kind of risk is a critical level of risk or a critical category of risk, right? In the next column, you have resources needed. So in the risk assessment matrix, there is also a third dimension. So I'll re-explain. One dimension is the probability, second dimension is the impact, the third dimension is the amount of resources that you need to mitigate the risk. That represents the size of these bubbles. So for example, R003 is the smallest size of the bubble, which means that there is the least amount of resources that are required to mitigate this risk. Whereas R004 is the largest size of the bubble, which means that this risk needs largest amount of resources to be mitigated. So this risk assessment matrix is a great visualization tool for you to understand how different risks are placed and what is it that you have to target first before the other risks. So for example, here you see R001 is already in the green zone, which means that it is a sustainable risk, whereas R004 is in the red zone, which means it's a critical risk. So if you are confined on resources and you have to prioritize between which risk to tackle first, this gives you a straightaway answer, which means here you will be targeting R004 before anything else because it is a critical risk. So that is the power of this risk assessment matrix, and it doesn't end here. I'll come back to it. So coming back to our risk database, here we have talked about the resources needed. Here we have three options. You have high, medium, low. You can choose as per your assessment. Now the exercise does not only stop at just estimating the risks. It also goes a step further. That is the power of this module, right? Here you see that now as a private security agency, what will be your mitigation strategy for a particular risk? We all know that there are 4 mitigation strategies: avoid, reduce, transfer, and accept. So in this example, we are following a reduce strategy for all of the 4 risks that we have identified, and we have described as to how we want to go about mitigating that particular risk. This is your job as a private security agency to communicate clearly to your client as to what is it that you have identified in terms of risk and what is it that you are going to do in terms of a mitigation strategy to deal with that particular risk, right? So once you have employed your mitigation strategy, you forecast that the residual impact is in this column. So you see, for example, vandalism had an impact of 30 lakhs, but due to your risk mitigation strategy, the residual impact is only 10 lakh rupees. So you have reduced the risk in terms of the impact that it causes. And not only have you reduced the impact, but you have also reduced the probability of its occurrence. So here vandalism had a 10% probability, but with your mitigation strategy, you have brought it down to 5%. So what has it done? It has essentially shifted this particular risk from a moderate category to a sustainable category of risk. And that is where you can clearly convey to your client that this is the value that you bring to the table as a private security agency. So all in all, you see, we had only one risk which was in the sustainable category, but now with your mitigation strategies, you have got 2 risks in the sustainable category, and the other 2 also have been bumped down in terms of the dangerousness that they have. So that is how you use this risk assessment matrix to your advantage, right? Now this risk assessment matrix is dynamic. You can keep adding risks and it will auto populate, and I'll show you how. For example, I've already tabulated a sample risk. We are calling it a fire hazard, right? And I'll add the details here quickly. So here you see we have only 4 risks till now, which is why in the risk assessment matrix we have only 4 bubbles, right? So the moment I add another risk, you can expect to see one more bubble popping up here. So I'll just do that, right? So I'll just copy paste. Yeah. So here you see that we have added a new risk. The risk ID gets auto-generated. It's being called R005. Here you see we have put a risk description as well. And the impact and probability were 75 lakh and 10% respectively, putting this risk in a severe category. Now we believe that the resources needed would be of medium category, and the risk mitigation strategy that we want to employ again is reduce. So with our mitigation strategy, the impact reduces from 75 to 60 lakh, and the probability of occurrence reduces from 10% to 7%, even though the category still is severe. So that means there is more work that we need to keep doing on this particular risk, right? So now coming back to the risk assessment matrix, as I had already said, you see a 5th circle, which is R005 here, because now you have added another risk and it's in the severe category, right? Light red. So this is the power of this tool. And not just that, with your risk mitigation strategies, you can also visualize the kind of impact that you're creating in this particular matrix. So you see this says with mitigation. Here you see the bubbles have all shifted towards the green zone, towards left of the matrix, right? Because you, with your mitigation strategies as a cutting edge private security agency, have been able to bring down the level of riskiness for your client. And this is great visualization for the client, because now they see that where I had this kind of risk, where there were three big risks in my red area of the matrix, this particular PSA has brought it all down towards the greener zone, and which is why I have to employ this particular private security agency to secure my assets. Isn't it really powerful? So this is how this risk assessment matrix will make your operations really, really meaningful. Now coming back to the presentation. So we have already understood the difference between what a risk is versus what a threat is. And we have also seen how a risk assessment matrix looks like and works. But there are certain requirements for you to be able to nail down this particular skill of risk assessment, right? So this is just a definition of risk assessment matrix that we have already seen. But what are the skills required for accurate risk assessment? One, of course, is threat identification. When you are doing this exercise, you need to be extremely thorough with your observations so as to not ignore a particular threat. You must be able to identify and tabulate all the threats that exist for your potential client. The other is financial analysis, because the impact of a threat is a financial metric because it is in rupee terms. So you need to be able to understand how to evaluate the rupee impact of a threat. Third is asset valuation. The rupee impact of a threat is closely linked with the value of a particular asset that you are protecting. So you should be able to evaluate that particular asset very, very accurately. The fourth is probabilistic estimation. As we know, one of the components of risk is the impact. The other one is the probability of that particular threat getting realized. So you need to be very, very thorough with how you estimate how likely a particular threat is to getting realized. Then, of course, there is presentation and communication skills, because it is a visualization tool. So once you have done this exercise, you must visualize what you have done. You must visualize what you can do for your client and then communicate it seamlessly to your end client. And the last one is, of course, OSINT, which is short for open source intelligence. Your threat assessment will rely heavily on open source intelligence before you take up an assignment with a potential client. So these are the skills that you must seek to develop. Now, why should you care, right? I have elaborated on the pros of why risk assessment matrix is such a powerful tool. I'll just summarize again, right? One is identification. As a PSA, a risk assessment matrix will give you the process orientation to seamlessly and very logically organize the threats that you have identified and the risks that you have calculated. Second is prioritization. As we have already seen, a risk assessment matrix lets you prioritize in terms of which risk to tackle first and which risk to tackle later, and with what kind of resources, the magnitude of resources, right? The third, of course, and most important one is visualization. Your end clients need to see the value that you bring to the table. Security as a subject, as a function, as a service is intangible in nature. So your job as a PSA is to convey tangible value to your client. You must help your client see the value that you create for them. So this tool gives you that power of visualization. And all these put together make risk assessment your biggest competitive advantage. Because of course, once you develop the skills that I've already shown you and you organize the output of those skills in the way that I've shown you in terms of the risk assessment matrix, your client will simply be blown away. And that, my friend, will become your competitive advantage over all your competitors, over all your peers. So now you know why this is important. So that's the end of it. We at 360 PSA work with private security agencies, only a handful of them who really have the keenness to succeed in the private security industry, which is now ripe for disruptive transformation. So if this made sense to you, then feel free to get in touch and we'll see you in the next video.